Hi, this is Pastor Marker Hetzner. This is an experiment to see if I can connect with those of you who are not able to or quite ready yet to join us in our gospel study of Mark in the reading through. I sent you an outline, I believe, with a previous email. I'm going to be using that outline and just walking through some of the highlights, reading some of the passages, but trusting that you'll have your Bible open and you'll pause this video and do the reading as we walk through it. The outline begins with a few things to introduce and meet Mark, the author of this gospel. And it starts off by saying, with a fill in the blank here, Mark is not an apostle. He's not one of the 12, okay? But he is an eyewitness of the life and ministry of Jesus, so that he was a person who was around and there as the gospel takes place. Mark chapter 14 is an interesting place to start. Back in verse 51 and 52, we find the verses leading up to that is Jesus praying in the Garden of Gethsemane on that Thursday of Holy Week. And then are the verses where Judas betrays him and is arrested. And then verses 51 and 52 is a little story that is just told in the Gospel of Mark. Not in Matthew, not in Luke, not in John. We are told a young man followed Jesus with nothing but a linen cloth about his body, and they seized him, and he left the linen cloth and ran away naked. We have assumed for years that this is perhaps Mark inserting himself into the story, that he was in that upper room when Jesus instituted the Lord's Supper and was in the group that followed Jesus and was there observing the arrest, and then probably ran away with no one noticing him except the one who grabbed him and him noticing himself. An embarrassing story where he introduces himself, and maybe it's in his gospel because he's the only one who knew about it. Chapter 14 then ends with the story of Peter denying Jesus. And in verse 72, we are told that immediately the rooster crowed a second time. And Peter remembered how Jesus had said to him, before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. It's interesting that only Mark mentions the rooster crowing twice. Matthew and Luke, in telling of their story, only have it crowing. Often thought that Mark received a lot of his story in his conversations with Peter, and that this was then a little more accurate telling of the story. And again, as Mark includes his own embarrassment, he has more greater detail of a great embarrassment from Peter as well. The Gospel of Mark has 16 chapters, and the last chapter ends with verse 8, where we are told they went out and fled from the tomb. This is the end of the Easter story. They fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. And you notice probably in your Bible after that in brackets it says something like, some of the earliest manuscripts do not include the following verses 9 through 20. We don't really know how the Gospel of Mark ends. It seems like those other verses were written by someone else. It's a different writing style. It has other things that are not really congruent with the scriptures themselves. But it also seems strange that Mark would end his gospel with, they were afraid. So is it that we've lost the end of the scroll of the autograph that he wrote and we don't really know how he ended? Or is it perhaps that he didn't get a chance to end it? Maybe he got taken away or martyred even. We don't know. But what we do know is that through verse 8 is the Gospel of Mark. And we just suspect that there's something missing that others felt uncomfortable with and tried to add on something else. Well, we have Mark as an eyewitness, so he is in Judea. there with the first believers. So then we go to the Gospel of, or after the Gospels, to the book of Acts, the fifth book in the New Testament, to pick up the story some more. And in Acts chapter 12, we find that the church is just starting to grow and move forward. And Paul has been converted on the road to Antioch. And Barnabas has introduced him to the 12 in Jerusalem. And then we are told in Acts chapter 12, verse 12, well, what's going on in chapter 12? James, the brother of John, is martyred, the first of the 12 to be killed. And then they arrest Peter, just like they had arrested James, and the community is expecting him to be killed as well, but an angel comes and makes Peter invisible, it seems like, and just takes him out of the jail, walks right past everybody. And then he gets him out in the streets at night in Jerusalem, and then the angel disappears. And Peter goes rushing, to the place where he knew the believers were gathering in those first days. And in chapter 12, verse 12, we are told, when Peter, realized that he was freed, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose other name was Mark, where many were gathered together and were praying. Here we are introduced by name to the individual who writes the Gospel of John, or Gospel of Mark. His name is John Mark. We'll talk more as we go down the road about how I think Jesus used a lot of nicknames. And here's probably our first, in our conversation together, first illustration of that. Chapter 12 in Acts then goes on at the end of it to say that after that gathering, Barnabas and Saul returned from Jerusalem when they completed their service, bringing with them John, whose other name was Mark. Barnabas had introduced Paul, who had been Saul, to the 12. And now that he was part of the believers, the central core of the church, they go off for him to begin his ministry to the Gentiles, and they take with him the author of the Gospel of Mark, John Mark. Well, then, as we read through, we find that in Acts chapter 13, that Paul and Barnabas depart on their first missionary journey. And verse 5 tells us of chapter 13 that they proclaimed the word of the God in the synagogues of the Jews, and they had with them John to assist them, John Mark. So Paul takes John Mark with him on his first missionary journey. But then it's interesting, a few verses later in verse 13, we're told, now Paul and his companions set sail from Paphos and came to Perga in Pamphylia. And John left them and returned to Jerusalem, but they went on to Perga and Antioch and so forth. Very shortly into this missionary journey, John Mark is a deserter. Homesick, scared, who knows? He leaves them and goes back. Paul and Barnabas continue on their missionary journey, as is told about in Acts chapter 13 and Acts chapter 14. They come back, and then they go to Jerusalem, where there is this big debate, the Jerusalem Council, as how Jewish do Gentile converts to the faith have to become. That's all resolved there in chapter 15. Barnabas and Paul then return to Antioch, his home base, where they get ready to go on Paul's second missionary journey. But listen to the last paragraph in Acts chapter 15 as they make these preparations. We pick up in verse 36. Paul said to Barnabas, "Let us return and visit the brothers in every city where we proclaim the word of the Lord and see how they are." Now Barnabas wanted to take with them John called Mark, but Paul thought best not to take him, who had withdrawn from them in Pamphylia and had not gone with them to the work. Barnabas says, "Let's bring him along, give him a second shot." And Paul says, "No way." Verse 39 says, "There arose a sharp disagreement, so that they separated from each other. Barnabas took Mark with him and sailed away to Cyprus, but Paul chose Silas and went in the other direction." Paul goes east without Mark, with Silas. Barnabas goes north and takes Barnabas with him. Wow, the first church split. And we'll call these guys saints, but we can see they're no really different from you and me. They have their problems, their disagreements. And whether it was right or wrong that they wouldn't take Mark, who knows? What we do know is that God then doubled their efforts, right? Got a new missionary in Silas and had them going in twice as many places because of what took place. God works all things together for good. Well, that gives us a little introduction into who wrote this Gospel of Mark. I'm going to pause this video and then start a second video that will then take us starting with Mark chapter 1, reading through those first verses.